All right. So these are excerpts from Grant Reed's book. I have a couple of copies of Grant Reed's book upstairs. Yes, perhaps on the metal cabinet. A couple of those. So if you'd like to go through a physical copy of that, those are available to you. A little review on scales. This section knows scales pretty well already, so I think we're good there. Um, both the architects and the engineer scales describing different drawing sizes and drawing details. You all know how to read a scale now, relative to the position of the zero and using the portions to the left or the right of the zero, depending on which scale it is. But getting into tree heights and shrubs and those sizes, those are things that are not terribly familiar to you, okay? You interact with trees and shrubs here on the campus all the time, but there are some rules of thumb for different types of trees um, shown at either three-quarter maturity or full maturity. From specimen trees to canopy trees to ornamentals to evergreens, large, medium, and small shrubs. So canopy trees are trees that are considerably higher than above our head or even above buildings. Ornamental trees are trees that are selected primarily for their flowering capacity in either the fall or the spring. Right now you'll see ornamentals they're red in color, often called one species that's called burning bush that is very red at this particular time of year. But most ornamental trees are selected like dogwood and apple and pear are selected for their flowers in the spring. And they tend to be considerably shorter than the larger canopy trees. Start with your frame of reference on trees that you see here on campus, including the canopy trees that are just to the south of our building here. Those are all honey locusts at full maturity, so they are well above 40 to 50 feet high and 40 to 50 feet spread. Spread refers to the outward spread of the canopy itself. All those elements start to come together in plans. This is a residential scale plan for a little pool, probably either adjacent to a community center or a backyard or daycare center or something like that. You can start to see the different species that are described there, as well as the different materials, including you can see a wood deck and you can see maybe stone or concrete pavers, and you can see a variety of shrubs and grasses and ornamentals kind of adjoining that plan, and then a couple of different species of tree in that plan. But you'll notice that the overhead deciduous trees are drawn transparently, and the evergreens, there's a couple of evergreens that kind of look like spindles up there. They're not drawn transparently. So in this scale, overhead trees of the deciduous variety, the ones that shed leaves, are shown as transparent objects because they are overhead, and evergreens are not. So that's one rule of thumb to really consider when you're looking at drawing plans for landscape materials of that nature. Most quick trees can start either with a hand-drawn outline of a circle or freehand circle, very loose in pencil. You can also use a circle template. Just recommend those. I always have one handy. I've printed out some for you. If you don't have a circle template, I've printed out a few for you. And there are really straightforward techniques that allow us to describe different trees just with line weights and just with line types. More textured trees or those lower to the ground, this might include the ornamentals that I spoke of, those things that flower in the spring or have a certain presence in the autumn. These kind of look like, we're looking at them from overhead, so you can see layers of foliage around the outline of the plant, and a technique that involves some looping or some doodling. And he says select a foliage texture doodle just to kind of describe the outline of the plant, and then show some of the curvature and contours of the plant as if you were looking at it from overhead. And those layer up to give it the illusion of a rounded object looking at it from plan. You can see also that he doesn't draw all the way around. He leaves a lot of white here because that supports that illusion of the curvature of the plant when we look at it from above. Conifer or evergreens, coniferous trees, conifer, think cone, okay, or evergreens. There are a couple techniques for them. They're a little bit, you can see this is a little bit more aggressive because of the pointedness or the pointy nature of some of the needles, etc. But a lot of folks will use a radius technique to describe an evergreen or a conifer tree because it is a succession of branches that radiate from the central stem. And that technique has been pretty well accepted and used to describe evergreens in plan because you can see them right away. You can distinguish that technique from other deciduous trees right away because you say, oh, that's probably an evergreen tree because of all the branches that radiate from the center radius. Larger overhead branch pattern trees, like the honey locusts on our south side or getting into maple and oak, involve drawing them in plan just as they grow. So be thinking of a central trunk with some primary branches, secondary branches as he describes, and then tertiary branches all the way to the outward diameter of the spread. So I often look like it looks like a starfish that's fallen to its death and hit the pavement. Okay? You can start with a 5 or 6 pointed thing and then start to add secondary and tertiary branches to that. And that starts to describe a large deciduous tree in plan pretty well. There are other ways of getting there. I call this the poinsettia method, where you start with 5 or 6 points and then you put smaller branches in between them. Kind of looks like a pinwheel. Other folks kind of use these curvature of just kind of looping in there. I tend to draw this style here. So that tends to be my tendency for this type of tree. Again, this would be for a large canopy tree in the form of like the honey locusts that are here, or a maple or an oak. And even larger trees like a beech or something like that, we can really get kind of into the gnarliness of the trunk and the primary branches, probably spreading over an entire property or an entire front yard or backyard. Shrubbery. Shrubs are rarely drawn individually. They're drawn as lines or as clusters. And so you can start with a succession of circles and then just do their general outline, because the shrubs do tend to grow together. All right, they tend to grow together. It kind of looks like bacteria in a petri dish. But they use some of the same deciduous symbols or just the outline. And you notice that a lot of folks will use a dot to describe the radius point of where the stem is in the ground. That identifies the exact planting position. Other grasses may involve a radius style technique of going in and out from a radius point, or a succession of lines radiating from that, very similar to the conifer, but this works for shrubbery and for grasses alike. When we get into landform, topographic lines that are shown in plan, the lines that are closer together indicate steepness. Lines that are further apart involve a gentler slope. So as you look at topo lines in a GIS map or in a internet map or things of that nature, you can look at the contours, and in a GIS viewer, you'll see that whenever lines are closer together, that involves a much steeper slope. When lines are further apart, it involves a gentler slope. So we can look at the landform and understand what's going on just by interpreting the topographic lines. We then represent those lines with different techniques. This is one technique. Another technique might be to actually dot it out. I'll show you an example of my work where I just dot the contour lines into the plan. But this is one way that landscape architects in history have indicated landform or a sloping mound or a sloping surface. Further out, if you're looking at a canyon, then this technique starts to describe the face of the canyon as it curves around a river. There's a river or stream at the bottom. There's kind of a boulder or pedestal down there at the riverbed, and then the other side of the canyon. So imagine flying over a canyon. This is a technique to describe what the landform that's happening if you were flying over a canyon and looking straight down. Then there's rocks and boulders. So some rocks and boulders are rounded, some are very craggy and edged, but the pen technique can describe it to the viewer pretty effectively. And so here's a rock wall, a stacked wall. Looking down at it in plan view, you would start to see the tops of this, could be limestone or flagstone, a stacked wall, and starting to see that curvature there, or just a succession of boulders in clusters with some touching and overlapping, as he indicates. On the ground plane, these are very specific techniques that involve the pen, and you can see the technique in the left column, which may involve a successive loops or lines or doodly things, but all of them work to describe different ground plane plants, things that are low to the ground. So ground level shrubbery or grasses or lawn or mulch. These techniques all can represent those things that are very low to the ground. And again, dots are often a very efficient way of describing lawn against other lower level plants or against other textures. There's more than one. Grass is not the only ground plane available to us. Grass, as you know, is an image of England that we brought to the United States. I don't know why we plant lawns, but we insist on planting them. But it is not the only ground plane available to you in terms of how different beds can be laid out and the like. So different textures can describe the different ground level foliage that grows very close to the ground. Then there's other textures, different dot and loop techniques. You can see a lot of small ovals and circles plus dots can describe gravel or different types of gravel or different types of pavement. It is not in our best interest to draw every single piece of stone. It is in our interest to create a technique that gives the impression that that is a stone paved surface. So, but in larger scales, you might wish to draw quite a bit there to give some character, but at a larger scale, at half or quarter scale. But in the smaller scales, it's not in our best interest to draw every single piece of gravel or every single piece of stone. It's in our interest to create a technique that gives the illusion that that is a stone surface. So you can see these different scales. This is at eighth scale and this is at quarter scale. There's more detail at the quarter scale than there is at eighth scale. And that goes for wood or for a brick patio. But again, it's not in our best interest to draw every single darn brick. It's in our interest to create the illusion that that is a brick pavement. Do you understand that difference? Right? It's not in our best interest to draw every single thing. When it comes to water, you want to distinguish the water from the thing that it's contained within. And so dots are really helpful. And dots and ripples and laps are really good techniques for describing the movement of water as it goes from one area to another, or the movement of water in a pool or in a fountain. Now a stream bed, a little bit more complex. There's lots of other things happening here. So in plan view, we've got kind of a cascade of a rock wall here and a rock wall here, and maybe this is flowing from different successive pools and around or over rocks, making turns until it finally flows out into a pond or lake. And there's technique involved here, there's line weight, there's descriptions of different plants that might be growing on the side of the face of the rock wall or on top of it, and then all the rocky stuff that happens there. But this is a way to describe those phenomena using only black ink and line weights. And the thick line weight creates a weight for the eye. The eye goes straight to it, and the eye then follows it around that succession. So the effective use of line weights helps create hierarchy in the drawing. Line weights also contribute to the illusion of shadow. So buildings cast shadows, taller trees cast shadows, clumps or clusters of shrubbery cast shadows, and we can use our thickest marker, chisel point marker, for doing that. It all comes together in a technique that's appropriate for this particular scale. So laying stuff out with circles, laying in technique, and then applying line weight and ground level technique makes it all kind of work together. Again, that thing in the middle is a transparent object. It refers to an overhead tree. If we showed every deciduous tree is an opaque object, it would cover up everything, right? But because an overhead tree is described as a transparent object, it allows us to see some of the ground level stuff that is planted below them. So that starts to communicate to the client that, oh, that's an overhead thing. That's a canopy tree, or that's a overhead tree. And there are things and textures and ground plane stuff that is planted below it. So this might be lawn, and this might be mulch, or this might be a creeping juniper, or a bed of perennials with 3 ornamental shrubs and then 2 trees planted above it. So that's sort of the graphic hierarchy that starts to happen in plan. And probably back to that one where we started. Then in section elevation, applying the same thoughts and the same rules of thumb for heights, we can start to describe what happens if we were to cut through the land and pull it away. You all did sections of well-designed objects earlier in the semester. You've looked at section previously also with one of your studio projects. But if you cut through the land and remove it and look at it from the side, we can describe some of the objectives that we might be trying to do here in terms of manipulating landform, or showing levels of water, or showing levels of planting or boulders and the like. And that thick section cut line describes the primary cut through the earth. And then trees in the distance are shown as in elevation view to describe the layers of depth that go back into the sky. So quick examples of laying out trees, quick outline, a quick stem, and then some contours or curvatures, describing different species of trees. Not all trees are the same. They don't all grow the same. So there's round and oval and columnar and conical. So as you look at different species here on campus, start to observe the general structure of a tree before you draw it, and that will allow you to really understand and represent them well. Because not all trees look the same. Every species has a different structure, a different order. But foliage texture trees, just as we drew them in plan, very similarly, we start with a general outline. We add a textured outline, and then we start to describe the layers of foliage that are there. Same for the conical or the evergreen trees. We start with a general outline, do the outward-looking foliage, so think needles, think fingers, think branches, all radiating from that central stem, and then try to achieve the illusion of texture and foliage in the evergreen tree. But we don't have to draw every leaf. We don't have to draw every leaf. We can use technique to give the illusion of layers of foliage. You can see these are kind of loopy, sketchy things. Here's the word cow in there. um, some folks have used different cursive letters. A lot of folks used to use cursive G's to describe different leaf form, but you can see that describes the general outline and then some additional detail in the shaded element, and then some curvature and contours on the trunks itself. That's very important. So notice how they're using contours to give the illusion that that's a rounded surface. They're not drawing the bark, they're drawing contours to give the illusion that that is a rounded trunk. And that's very effective, and those lines get denser and more successive as they get into the shade of the canopy there. And other examples of coniferous or trees or evergreens, these might be cedars. Cedars often have layers and where the stem is very visible. And then other pine and spruce tend to be sort of this conical pattern. And then you can look at out west. These might be ponderosas or other California redwoods or more appropriate species for that particular area. But you can see how these are successive layers of texture going up and kind of surrounding that central stem. Some of my work, I'll take you through some of these steps. We start with the general outline, and then we draw the structure. Other branch pattern trees, again, a central stem with primary, secondary, and tertiary branches. Drawing the tree very similarly to how we draw it in plan. And then kind of a representation of those different trees. Often, sometimes, you can even represent them in early spring, fall, or winter. If you're doing a winter drawing, you don't put a lot of foliage on the tree. You draw primarily its structure alone. Whereas in the summer, spring drawing, you might start to use both the structure and the impression of foliage hanging on the tree itself. Grasses and shrubs, we use grasses here a lot. Prairie grasses, box hedge, ornamental shrubbery, coniferous shrubbery. So this is almost like an explosion coming out of the ground. This is sort of like a cluster of smaller trees together. This is sort of radiating out like a fountain. These are all effective ways of describing different forms of shrubbery and grasses in elevation. And we'll practice some of that. Rocks and boulders, similar to plan, but kind of from the side, you can describe the different textures of stacked rocks or boulders. And then looking at paving in the ground plane, it might be vanishing to a perspective line of horizon or to a vanishing point. But again, it's not our objective to draw every single stone. It's just to give the impression of that. So when they come together and these section elevation views, they start to have this sort of character. We don't draw everything that's visible to infinity. We only draw what's visible in the design itself. But you can see some shade and shadow here starting to create some interest, and the scale figures kind of float above that and create the illusion of depth. The section cut line is a very thick line, and it really tells the viewer, hey, this is where we're excavating, this is where we're digging, this is how we're shaping the earth, and how the design follows that. And these can even start to describe different transportation corridors, bikeways or parkways, bike lanes. And sections can be really effective for describing buffering and blocking views, as well as shaping views. Here's a fun one for a zoo exhibit. And you can see the thick line of the cut of the earth and how the different exhibits are contained and then kind of framed by trees. An urban section would involve systems, trees, buildings, and then starting to lop off or label corridors within those. So that's kind of where we're headed in terms of one of the exercises in this particular workshop. You can see here a kind of a pergola, little stream, little bridge, a wall, and trees adorning it or framing it with boulders and rocks kind of down that embankment there. Here's a tropical example. A section frequently describes what's in the immediate background. So see these three trees here, then that becomes a line here. See this shelter here, that's the shelter. The car lines up with the car. The walkway, you can see the walkway going down to a bridge. You can see how that lines up. This bridge lines up with that. These three palms are there. And this garden is here. So, and then this viewing platform overlooking maybe a waterfront. At the broader scale or larger scale, the description of site graphics gets more intense. Okay, so these are drawings that might be at 1 inch equals 80 feet or 1 inch equals 100 feet or larger. You've got clusters of buildings, you've got whole fields, whole woodlots, and you're not in the business of drawing every single tree. You're in the business of drawing lines of trees or layers of trees, encapsulating urban spaces. But you can see how the buildings and the trees are all casting shadows, so it communicates pretty immediately what's part of the proposed and then what's existing. You can see the building footprints that are existing to the left, and everything proposed is casting a shadow. But at this point, in larger scale plans and drawings, you're looking at clusters of trees, not necessarily individual trees. You're looking at lines of trees as opposed to standalone trees. So see how they cluster together and start to describe different lines and different spaces and lines and nodes through this campus. Here's a marina resort. The sloped roofs are shaded, so the sunny side is depicted as light. This is the shaded side here is depicted with lines to describe maybe a metal or a tile roof, and then the entire building casts a shadow along with the trees with it. So that all those techniques start to come together, and you can see again lines of trees that are casting shadows as well. So all the techniques you've seen here coming together to describe landform, individual lines of clusters or trees, and then buildings casting shadows as well. With color, that can add more character as well. That's the same plan from one of the previous examples rendered in color. A local example, east side of Muncie, released recently, describing different land uses. So this will be the new gateway to Muncie on Jackson Street. Some examples of my work. This is the former Pause campus where Garfield was made. So this is the layout. I'm bringing in the contours, laying out new proposed buildings and parking and uses and extensions to things in a draft, and then that's the final rendered plan. So this was a reuse concept for portions of the Pause campus. Pause Incorporated was the company that oversaw all of the artwork and products that had the Garfield image. Jim Davis, the artist, still lives north of the property here, and so when he sold this portion of the property to a new owner, they wanted to explore expanded uses for this as a retreat center or education center, and even having some aquaponic agriculture and some cabins and recreation on site. Closer to downtown Muncie, there's kind of a nearly abandoned portion of the downtown close to this brewery. We did a couple proposals for a tiny home village, and these are about 1 inch equals 10 feet. And so again, I'm showing overhead trees as transparent objects, so you can see the buildings below them and pathways and things like that. So kind of a food truck hub here, aquaponics center here in the middle, community garden. And then a site that you all know pretty well. This is the large acreage right next to 332 exit. So that's a proposal for a large agricultural center, which may or may not happen. We'll see. Other examples from other practices. You can follow these folks on Instagram. Russ Tyson out of Portland, Maine. Really great site plans combined with diagrams. And then larger plan drawings by some of our alumni. You can see that creek bed in there. And a proposal for downtown Lawrence, where you can see again building uses, open spaces, and lines of trees. We'll begin with the basic geometry of trees. We can use a non-photo blue pencil for that purpose. Non-photo blue pencil is really great for laying out geometries if you don't want that to appear on the scan itself. I'm going to use a standard pencil for the demonstration because it shows up on camera much better. So I'll begin with just a basic circular deciduous tree in elevation. I'll drop down, look at that in plan as well. I'll do a basic evergreen or conifer. Its conical shape, carry that down, drop that into plan as well. And I'll do a different shape tree, one of the different trees we see here on campus. Maybe think of that as an oblong shape in plan as well. So laying those out in pencil first. The pencil is of course erasable. And then I grab my fine line pen and in plan. We can start in plan or we can start in elevation first, whichever you like, however your thinking supports it. I like to draw the tree exactly the way that it grows, so from the ground plane and then up into a line of nutrition, which we call the trunk. These tend to be very thin in terms of our trunk. You can always add width to a trunk. It's very difficult to take it away. But very quickly into the canopy, the lines of nutrition divide into what we call primary branches. So I divide about 5 or 6 lines of nutrition. In the conifer, they divide very quickly, very low to the ground, get primary branches from that center trunk. Here, they'll reach a certain point and then divide into a few lines, primary lines of nutrition. Photosynthesis from the leaves, minerals and water from the earth join together so the tree can process those things into sugars. Then they divide into secondary branches. Secondary branches. Secondary branches. And finally, tertiary branches. You can carry those tertiary branches all the way to the geometry of the canopy that you've selected. I always talk through the system and understand how a tree grows and why a tree exists and what it's doing in order to
process. Its nutrition kind of reminds you how to draw the tree. Kind of reminds you of the bordering system of the tree, the structure, the general structure of the tree. Carry those all the way to tertiary branches here. There's another primary branch over here, kind of join them together. I always like to add a few contour lines around the trunk. Gives it a little bit of darkness and kind of reminds us that that is a rounded surface there. So if we jump down the plan, then we might think of the primary branches coming from the center of the trunk. Primary, secondary, tertiary. Tertiary branches, we can take them all the way to the outward diameter. They can overlap. They can move. So primary, secondary, tertiary branches. All the way to the radius point. That's standard early spring winter tree. Conifer or evergreen, central radius point, primary, secondary branches all radiating from that point. They tend to gather more branches on the shaded side of the tree and less branches on the sunny side of the tree. It's a very standard kind of radius drawing. We kind of accept this outward primary and secondary branch system while respecting and radiating around the central trunk. This one I might spread out a little bit. Maybe there's a big trunk and then a divide into the primary branches. Maybe this is a maple or an oak. Divide. Divide. Until we reach the canopy. And then I can apply a scribbling, doodling technique to describe edge of the foliage as it wraps around and defines that tree canopy. Here in the elevation, I'll extend that out. We can see quite a few trees here on campus that the leaves are kind of follow the primary branches on the pathway outward. Start to join together, or start to create levels, or start to create areas of shade or darkness, or areas of negative space. Associated squirrels' nests or bird nests. Some dots to sort of spread that out. Dots here in the plan view as well. Just to spread that out. Similarly on the evergreen, I'll take that edge, I'll work a scribble, doodle line that I think about pine needles or spruce needles. There, more of a concentration on the shaded side, And similarly in elevation, I'll do an outline, broken scribbling technique all the way up to the top. There's some darkness down in here. So those darker boughs of the evergreen kind of collect together to form that denser interior. Similarly, carry some of this outline. We wanted to do a spring or summer tree. Imagine areas of leaf cover and foliage attaching to those tertiary and secondary branches. We'll put a dot, spreads it out as well. So 3 very different shaped trees together now in both plan and elevation. It's a way of making every tree that you draw be fairly unique, just as they appear in nature. This way, if you draw these trees as a system, step-by-step system like this, you'll be able to inject subtle variations across every tree that you draw. And depending on where the shaped side is, a little bit of dot, a little bit of loop, dots and loops. Depending on where your light source is, what part of the world you're in, the light source might be on one side and the cast shadow would be away from the light source. I can use the chisel marker, the chisel sharpie, start to cast an appropriately shaped shadow from the canopy of the tree onto the ground. For the conifer, the shadow is slightly conical shape. This is very easy to overdo, don't overdo it. But the conifer tree does cast a conical shaped shadow. And maybe a little bit further spread on this one. Cover your snakes, fill in gaps as you wish, to imagine the cast shadow from this mighty tree onto the ground plane. Gives a dimension, makes it really pop. Okay, got a lot of negative space in there. I might add another. Just add more to that. Okay, so 3 trees in elevation, 3 trees in plan. Next I'll do some different hedges, shrubs, and grasses. So we have an ornamental tree or flowering shrub. There we have some lower evergreen shrubs here. Maybe we have a box hedge there. And maybe some grasses here. And some broadleaf perennial closer to the ground there. So 4 or 5 different varieties there. Starting from the ground plane, this becomes very similar. Some of these lower flowering shrubs, they fan out, but they are structurally very similar to a deciduous tree. Maybe they're selected for their flowering qualities in the spring or their autumnal qualities in the fall. This might be a lower, shorter ornamental tree or flowering shrub. Maybe we have an evergreen, we have a center line of nutrition in the middle, but we take that evergreen technique in and out until we reach the peak of that cone. shrub. Switch out for a different pen. We're just going to reinforce that needly texture as we reinforce also the structure of the shrub. Get a little bit of shade and shadow there on the ground plane. And these cast shadows onto each other, so there will be some shade and shadow involved there. Box hedge is several plants kind of planted in a row, and they grow together, so their stems might be visible or not, but a very dense, thick pattern of growth that is pruned and trimmed using a hedge trimmer. Very dark underbelly, dark underlying area underneath the base of the hedge. I then can use dot and loop to reinforce that texture. There's darkness or things, kind of leaves or things like that, kind of gathering underneath them. And then practice some grasses. Grasses tend to grow in clusters, so I take a technique where the pen starts and then makes an arc and starts to lift, turn, lift, and turn, lift, and turn, until the grasses kind of reach a crown or a corona. And I finish that off with a dot. So think of this as one big cluster of prairie grass. Think about another cluster maybe here. Lift, turn, lift, and turn, lift. So we make a strike and then we slowly, quickly lift the pen, lift, to give that impression of the tall prairie grass. There's always parts of the grass that kind of bow over and things like that, so they don't all want to be kind of in the same direction. You want a few of these to turn and depict the kind of grass, the different lengths of grass kind of bowing over like that. So that's a line of a few different species that we frequently find in these types of drawings in this part of the world. In plan view, we might see this, and similarly, it's a collection of clusters of plants, grasses, might be seen overhead as a series of dots. Maybe radii associated with the plant for each cluster. Hedge might be seen very similarly to how it's drawn in elevation. Above, manicured tight line, this with lots of dot and loop. Conifers might use some similar technique we did for the conifer tree, and let these kind of overlap into one another. flowering ornament over the flowering tree there. Use a similar deciduous technique for that. That might all join together in a common shadow. Or depending on the hierarchy of your plan, you may not have much shadow at all in lower plants like this. You can also use shadow to show the height, relative height of these different plants against each other. That may be part of the bed. There may be a technique for mulch or ground cover. Different techniques representing ground cover against a line or a datum of some kind, differentiating one ground cover from another. This could be a low creeping ground cover, or it could be mulch, gravel. Dot might describe a lawn, or turf against that datum. Broadleaf perennials might be introduced. This is sort of back and forth, up and down, back and forth, back, up and down. It's part of the design as well. That could be tulip or gladiolas. Those broadleaf perennials, hostas, those might be located on the edge of the bed. Plan as well. Back and forth, radius point. So, variety of species, lower to the ground species, form of ornamentals, hedge, smaller conifers, broadleaf perennials, together in a bed, depicted as such.